The Persian Empire, one of the largest and most powerful empires the world has ever seen. Spanning from India to Egypt, it was a land of unimaginable wealth, power, and complexity. Persia was ruled by kings who wielded authority like the gods themselves. And it was under the reign of King Xerxes I that our story begins. At the heart of this empire was the royal palace in Susa, the capital city, a place of marble halls, golden ceilings, and endless extravagance. Here, King Xerxes reveled in the luxury of his position. He was surrounded by advisors, noblemen, and courtiers, all eager to maintain their place in his favor. His court was not only a political center, it was a place of celebration, of feasts that stretched for days and nights. Every banquet, every gathering was a reminder of the king's unshakable power. But beneath the surface of wealth and splendor, there were whispers of political intrigue. In the world of kings and kingdoms, loyalty could be fleeting, and betrayal was never far behind. And it was in this world of power, opulence, and ruthless politics, that the fate of an entire people would be decided. It was a world where a single woman's courage would set the stage for a series of events that would change history. But this wasn't a world of queens, at least not yet. It began with a king, King Xerxes, whose pride and arrogance would soon set in motion the chain of events that would bring Esther to the throne. Xerxes, intoxicated by his own power, decided to hold a feast unlike any the world had ever seen. For 180 days, he displayed the splendor of his empire, parading his riches and might in front of all who would watch. The feast wasn't just a celebration, it was a proclamation of his dominance, a reminder that he ruled over all. But even the mightiest of kings are not invincible. And as the festivities wore on, a quiet rebellion was brewing beneath the gilded surface. Queen Vashti, the queen of Xerxes, would soon defy the king in a moment of pride and dignity, which would change the course of history. Her defiance would set the stage for the rise of a new queen, one whose courage in the face of an impossible choice would define her legacy. Esther, a woman whose name would be remembered for centuries, would step into this world of power, politics, and danger. But before we meet her, we must first understand the world she was born into, a world where kings reigned supreme, and the fate of all was in the hands of a few. The story of Esther begins with the fall of a queen. It is from this event that Esther's destiny would emerge, a story of faith, courage, and sacrifice that would challenge the very foundations of an empire. In the heart of the Persian Empire, the king's word was law, unyielding, unchallenged, and absolute. King Xerxes, drunk not just on wine, but on the vastness of his own power, commanded the people around him to obey without question. But one person, one woman, would dare defy him. It began with a grand feast, a banquet so lavish it would make the world tremble. For 180 days, King Xerxes celebrated the splendor of his reign, displaying his wealth and might for all to see. His courtiers and nobles marveled at the excess, golden goblets, exquisite silks, and music that filled the air with a promise of endless pleasure. The kingdom of Persia bent to the king's will, and the people were eager to please him. But Xerxes was not content. He sought to display his wealth not only in riches, but in power over all, even over those closest to him. The moment came when, in the midst of his drunken revelry, the king ordered Queen Vashti, his wife, to appear before him. He demanded that she show her beauty to his guests, to parade herself like one of his possessions, a symbol of his power over her and the empire. Her beauty, it seemed, was just another piece of his grand display. But Vashti was no mere possession. She was a queen in her own right, and her dignity was not for sale, not even to her king. With quiet resolve, Vashti refused to obey. She would not allow herself to be objectified even by the king. She would not stand before a room full of drunken men who would reduce her to an object of display. Her refusal was a shocking act of defiance. In a world where women had little power, where their voices were often silenced, Vashti's decision was revolutionary. It was an act that would cost her everything: her position, her place by the king's side, her crown. The news of her refusal spread like wildfire through the palace. Xerxes, his pride wounded, was furious. His advisors, fearing that the king's authority might be undermined, urged him to act swiftly. If Vashti's disobedience was left unpunished, they warned, other women might follow her example, challenging the established order of the empire. Xerxes, humiliated by his wife's refusal, made a decision that would alter the course of history. He stripped Vashti of her title, banishing her from the palace forever. The queen who had once stood beside him, who had shared in the glory of his reign, was now gone, her name erased from the annals of Persian history. But Vashti's fall was not the end. It was only the beginning. In her place, Xerxes would seek another queen, one who would be chosen not for her defiance, but for her beauty, her obedience, and her ability to be controlled. And it was in the wake of Vashti's fall that Esther's story would begin. For while Vashti's removal was a blow to the women of Persia, it set the stage for the rise of someone unexpected, someone whose courage and conviction would shake the very foundations of the empire. But first, the king must find his new queen. And so, a new chapter began. One that would bring Esther, a young Jewish woman from a distant, unknown people, into the royal palace. The fall of Queen Vashti would leave a vacancy, a throne waiting for the one who would dare to sit in it. In the aftermath of Queen Vashti's fall, the Persian court was in disarray. The loss of a queen, the very symbol of royal authority, left a void, an empty throne that would be filled, they hoped, by someone who would restore order and demonstrate unquestioning loyalty. King Xerxes, in his grief and humiliation, sought a new queen, one who would comply with his every command and serve his whims without hesitation. The king, surrounded by his most trusted advisors, issued a royal decree. Every young woman in the empire, from the highest nobility to the humblest servant, was to be brought to the palace. They would be presented before the king, and he would choose the most beautiful and obedient among them to take Vashti's place. The search for a new queen had begun. Across the empire, women were summoned to the royal palace. They came from every corner of Persia, brilliant and beautiful, each hoping to be the one chosen. But amongst the sea of women, one name would rise above all others: Esther. Esther was no princess. She was a young Jewish woman living in the shadow of a turbulent empire. Raised by her cousin Mordecai after the death of her parents, Esther's life had been one of quiet simplicity. Her beauty, however, was undeniable, and it caught the eye of those who sought the king's new queen. Yet, Esther was not chosen because of her status. She was chosen because of something far more important: her character. Esther had been raised with values that would prove more valuable than beauty alone. She was humble, wise beyond her years, and most importantly, she had the courage to follow the guidance of her cousin Mordecai, a man who was wise in the ways of the Persian court. Mordecai, who worked at the palace gate, had warned Esther to keep her Jewish identity a secret. In a land where Jews were a minority and their presence often unwelcome, it was safer to hide her heritage. The king's court was no place for someone to stand out in a way that might bring harm. And so Esther entered the palace, her true identity concealed, her name among many others vying for the king's favor. As the women arrived at the palace, they were given a year of preparation, an elaborate regimen of beauty treatments, perfumes, and oils designed to prepare them for the king's gaze. But Esther, though beautiful, stood apart from the rest. It was not her external beauty that set her apart. It was her grace, her poise, and the kindness that radiated from within her. She charmed everyone around her, not through flashy gestures or showy displays, but with a quiet strength and humility that made her unforgettable. Among all the women in the harem, Esther found favor with Haggai, the king's eunuch in charge of the women. Haggai saw something in her that the others did not, something that would make her stand out to the king. He treated Esther with special care, giving her the best place in the palace and providing her with additional beauty treatments. But it was not just her outer appearance that Haggai admired. It was her composure, her calmness in a world that thrived on manipulation and rivalry. Esther's time in the palace was filled with uncertainty. She knew that the king's decision was final, that her future depended entirely on his approval. But Esther did not allow fear to consume her. She trusted in Mordecai's counsel and in the strength that her upbringing had instilled in her. When the day came for Esther to stand before King Xerxes, she was nervous, as any young woman might be. Yet, as she entered the king's chambers, she did not flinch or cower. She stood tall, exuding the kind of inner strength that only those who face adversity head-on can possess. And when Xerxes saw her, when his eyes met hers, the world fell away. The grandeur of the palace, the grandeur of the empire, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the quiet strength and beauty that Esther possessed. The king, overcome by her presence, chose her to be his queen. No pomp or ceremony was needed. The king's decision was final, and Esther was crowned as the new queen of Persia. A young woman from a humble background had risen to the highest position in the empire. But with that crown came more than just power and luxury. Esther's journey was far from over. The beauty of her ascent to the throne was not just in her appearance, but in her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of the Persian court. Esther was not just a queen by title. She was a woman who would soon prove that true royalty comes from within. Her reign would be marked not by opulence, but by courage in the face of crisis. And it was this courage that would ultimately make Esther one of the most enduring figures in the history of the Persian Empire. Esther had been chosen, not by chance, but by fate. And as the new queen of Persia, her role in the kingdom was just beginning. As the new queen of Persia, Esther found herself surrounded by wealth, power, and luxury. But with that privilege came immense responsibility. She was not simply a queen to King Xerxes. She was the hidden heart of a people in peril. But her role in the palace was still one of delicate balance. She had entered the king's court at a time when no one, not even the noblest in the empire, could predict what would unfold. Yet, even in the midst of this grand, gilded world, it was her cousin Mordecai who remained her anchor. Mordecai, though not a noble, had found his place within the king's court. His position at the palace gate gave him a constant watchful eye on the happenings within the royal walls. Though Esther had risen to power, Mordecai's guidance, wisdom, and faith remained her silent strength. Mordecai was a man of faith, but also a man of action. As much as he loved Esther, he knew that the world she had entered was dangerous, full of those who would seek to undermine and betray even the mightiest. And it was this watchfulness, this keen understanding of the world of power, that would lead him to uncover a dangerous conspiracy. It happened quietly, almost unnoticed. Mordecai was sitting at the palace gate when he overheard two royal eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, whispering of a plot against the king's life. These men, trusted servants within the royal court, had grown bitter and resentful. In their anger, they had schemed to assassinate King Xerxes, to rid the palace of its ruler. Mordecai's instincts kicked in. He knew that if this plot were to succeed, it would not only endanger the king, it would place Esther's life in jeopardy. So, without hesitation, Mordecai took action. He sent word to Esther, using her position as queen to alert the king of the conspiracy. Esther, understanding the severity of the situation, wasted no time. She quickly passed the information to King Xerxes, crediting Mordecai as the source of the discovery. The king, who had likely never considered such a threat within his own palace, ordered an immediate investigation. The plot was uncovered, and Bigthan and Teresh were arrested. Their lives were taken, their bodies publicly displayed, as a warning to all who might dare to defy the king's authority. But for Mordecai, it was not just the defeat of the plot that was significant. It was his quiet heroism. He had saved the king's life, yet he asked for no reward, sought no recognition. The matter was closed in the king's mind, and the event was recorded in the annals of the kingdom as a mere incident, nothing more than a brief moment of courtly intrigue. But this moment would not be forgotten. It was the first of many quiet, unseen acts of bravery and loyalty that would shape the course of the future. Mordecai's discovery of the plot would not only preserve the life of King Xerxes, but also plant the seed of a much larger story. One day, the king would need to recall this act of loyalty, and Esther's role would be tested in ways she could never have predicted. At this moment, Esther was safe in the palace, secure in her position. But beneath the surface of the royal court, shadows began to gather. There were those whose ambitions would not rest, who would challenge the very foundation of the Persian Empire. And as the events unfolded, Mordecai's quiet loyalty would one day place Esther in the midst of a crisis, one that would force her to decide the fate of her people. But for now, the court went on, unaware of the storm that was quietly brewing. In the grand halls of the Persian palace, the fate of an empire often lay in the hands of men who maneuvered in the shadows, hungry for power and glory. King Xerxes, though mighty in name, was not always the sole architect of the empire's future. His decisions, like those of any ruler, were shaped by those he trusted most. Among these advisors, one man would rise above the rest, a man whose ambition would one day put the lives of an entire people in peril. This man was Haman. Haman, a man of great wealth and prestige, was ambitious beyond measure. His rise to power within the court was swift, fueled by a combination of cunning, charm, and ruthless ambition. He was appointed the king's highest-ranking advisor, second only to Xerxes himself, and given a place of honor at the king's side. But for all his titles, Haman's heart was not content. The riches and status he had acquired were not enough to fill the emptiness within him. What he truly craved was power, absolute, unquestioned power over all. It was here, in the palace of Susa, that Haman's lust for power began to reveal its darker side. Xerxes, for all his grandeur, was a king easily swayed by those who flattered him, and Haman knew how to play the game. He sought the king's favor by suggesting policies that would benefit his own ambitions, securing his position and advancing his goals with each passing day. But it was not enough. Haman wanted more. He demanded that all the king's subjects bow before him, acknowledging him as a figure of supreme importance. This decree was not just a matter of respect, it was a matter of dominance. In the halls of the palace, all eyes turned to Haman, waiting to see who would bend the knee, who would acknowledge his superiority. Yet there was one man who would not kneel: Mordecai. Mordecai, as a loyal servant of the king and a man of strong conviction, refused to bow before Haman. He would not pay homage to someone who, in his eyes, was no more than a man driven by greed and pride. Mordecai's refusal infuriated Haman, whose ego could not tolerate such defiance. The act of one man, in his mind, was a challenge to his very authority, and Haman could not abide it. At first, Mordecai's disobedience was a mere irritation to Haman, but as time passed, his anger grew, fueled by the bitterness of an unchallenged ambition. Haman was not a man who forgave slights. He saw them as threats that must be eradicated, and so he devised a plan, not just to punish Mordecai, but to annihilate him and all his people. Haman's plan, however, would not be so simple. He knew that Mordecai's defiance could not be punished without bringing down the wrath of the Jewish people. So Haman's scheme grew darker, more insidious. He decided that if he could not destroy one man, he would destroy an entire people, the Jews, whom he saw as a threat, not just to his power, but to the order of the empire. Haman went to King Xerxes, spinning a tale of discontent among the Jews. He painted them as a rebellious people who refused to follow the king's laws, whose very existence threatened the stability of the empire. Haman offered to pay a great sum of silver into the king's treasury in exchange for a royal decree to annihilate the Jews, a genocide that would sweep across the entire empire. Xerxes, as was often the case, was easily persuaded by Haman's words. He saw no reason to question the advice of his most trusted advisor, and so, with little hesitation, Xerxes signed the decree. The die was cast, and the fate of the Jews was sealed. In one stroke, the king authorized the destruction of an entire people, a people who had lived under the protection of the Persian Empire for generations. News of the decree spread quickly throughout the empire, sending shockwaves of fear through the Jewish community. Haman's plot, once a whisper in the royal court, was now a deadly reality. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jews would be slaughtered, their homes destroyed, and their legacy erased. Mordecai, when he heard of the decree, was overwhelmed with grief. He tore his clothes in anguish, a visible sign of mourning, and poured ashes on his head. But his grief was not just for himself. He understood the gravity of the situation, the terrible fate that awaited not just him, but his people. And in this moment of despair, he knew that there was only one person who could stop this massacre: Esther. The queen, hidden behind the walls of the palace, was the only hope for the Jewish people. But would she dare to confront the king? Would she risk her position, her life, to save her people from the wrath of Haman? Mordecai's heart weighed heavy with the knowledge that Esther's courage would be tested in a way she could never have imagined. The fate of the Jewish people now rested in her hands, and the future of an entire nation would be decided by the courage of one woman. The decree had been signed. The wheels of fate were set in motion. In a distant corner of the empire, the shadow of genocide loomed over the Jewish people, and no one was more aware of this looming danger than Mordecai. The news had spread like wildfire, and the terror of annihilation hung heavy in the air. Mordecai's heart was torn in two. His grief and sorrow were as deep as the ocean, but it was the realization of what must come next that gripped him most. He knew that only one person could save the Jewish people, Esther, the queen of Persia. But the very thought of what he was asking of her filled him with dread. Esther, safe within the walls of the palace, was protected from the horrors of the world outside. She had risen to power not through conquest, but through her quiet strength, her beauty, and her character. Yet now, it was her courage that would be tested, and that courage would come at a great cost. Mordecai knew the king well. Xerxes was a man of unpredictable moods and temper, a man who valued his authority above all else. He was a king who could easily be swayed by Haman's manipulations, a man whose pride was as fragile as his power was vast. To approach him uninvited, to speak to him about a matter so delicate and dangerous as the lives of the Jewish people, could easily lead to Esther's death. For it was known throughout the kingdom that no one, not even a queen, could enter the king's presence without being summoned. To do so was to risk execution. Esther had risen to power in a world where women's voices were rarely heard. She had navigated the treacherous waters of the palace, but this was a test unlike any she had faced before. The stakes were higher now than ever before. The fate of an entire people, the people who had raised her, the people she had never forgotten, hung in the balance. Mordecai's message to Esther was clear and urgent, and yet there was no comfort in his words. He had sent word to her, imploring her to go to the king and plead for her people. He reminded her of her unique position. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? But Esther's response, though thoughtful, was fraught with fear. She knew the laws of the kingdom, the rigid lines that separated the royal family from the common folk. She knew that her approach to the king without invitation could lead to her own death. And yet, the choice was not just about her own safety, it was about her people. It was about a decision that could either save them or condemn them. For 3 days, Esther wrestled with the weight of the decision. She could not sleep, could not eat. The vision of the massacre of her people haunted her, the faces of her family and friends flickering in her mind's eye. She could not stand by, could not allow her people to perish, but the price of intervention was steep. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, Esther made her decision. With a heart filled with resolve, she sent a message to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. The courage it took to utter those words is immeasurable. Esther, the young queen, was about to step into the lion's den. She would approach the king, unbidden, and risk her life for the lives of her people. She knew the danger. She understood the cost. But in that moment, Esther's purpose became clear. This was why she had been placed in the palace, why she had been chosen to be queen. She was not just a queen of riches and luxury. She was a queen with a higher calling, a queen destined to save her people. As the 3 days of fasting and prayer began, the Jewish people united in their cause. Their prayers rose to the heavens, and the city of Susa became a place of solemn reflection and hope. Mordecai, too, prayed for his cousin, the queen. He knew that the outcome of this moment would forever shape their future. Esther, too, spent those days in prayer, fasting not only from food and drink, but from the very fear that threatened to paralyze her. She knew that her action would alter the course of history, one way or another. But her resolve was steadfast. She was no longer the young woman who had entered the palace in silence and submission. She was now a queen with a purpose, a queen whose actions would speak louder than any decree of a king. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes. She stood before the palace doors, taking a deep breath as she prepared to face the king. The future of the Jewish people rested on her shoulders, but she was no longer afraid. She had done all she could do. Now, it was time to take the final step, one that would either save her people or destroy them. With courage beyond measure, Esther approached the king, and as she entered the throne room, the king's eyes fell upon her. For a moment, the world stood still. The air in the room thickened, and Xerxes, seeing his queen approach, extended the golden scepter to her. He had spared her life. Esther had stepped forward, and the king had chosen to listen. But the real battle, the real test, was just beginning. The days of fasting and prayer had passed. and Esther, draped in her royal robes, stood before the gates of the king's palace. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. There was no turning back now. She had made the decision, but now she had to face the consequences. The laws of Persia were clear. No one, not even a queen, could approach the king without being summoned. To do so was to risk her life. It was a law that held power over even the mightiest of rulers, but Esther had chosen to defy it, placing her trust in a higher purpose. She was willing to face death if it meant the salvation of her people. As she walked toward the throne room, the weight of her decision grew heavier with each step. She knew the cost. If the king chose not to extend his scepter, her life would end in an instant. The silence of the palace halls was deafening, and the tension in her body was palpable. And then, as if time itself had paused, Esther entered the grand chamber. The king's throne, a symbol of his power and authority, sat high upon a dais, looking down upon all who would dare approach. King Xerxes, seated upon that throne, looked up as Esther entered. His eyes met hers. He saw her, and for a moment, it felt as if the whole world fell away. Esther was not the woman she had been when she first entered this palace. She was no longer a quiet, obedient queen living in the shadow of the empire's might. She was now a woman with purpose, with a cause that transcended her own survival. She was here to confront the king and save her people. She was here to risk everything. For a heartbeat, the room was still, and then, as if sensing the weight of the moment, Xerxes did what no one could have anticipated. He extended the golden scepter to Esther. The scepter was more than a gesture. It was a symbol of mercy, of favor, and of life itself. The king, in his wisdom, saw her courage and chose to grant her life. It was an act that would change everything. The tension that had gripped Esther's heart began to ease, but the battle was far from over. The hardest part was yet to come. Xerxes' voice echoed in the throne room, his words both regal and curious. "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." But Esther did not immediately speak. She had prepared for this moment, but she knew that the way forward was not through hasty words or reckless demands. Instead, she chose a path of wisdom, a path of strategy that would lay the groundwork for her plea. Esther's courage was not just in her actions, it was in her ability to wait, to listen, and to act at the right moment. "My king," she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet strength, "if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." Her request was simple, but it was laden with meaning. In a court where power was often a matter of spectacle and manipulation, Esther's invitation to the king and Haman was both subtle and bold. She did not reveal her hand just yet. She knew that to approach Xerxes with the full weight of her plea too soon would risk his anger, and she would need Haman, the architect of the plot, to be present to witness the unraveling of his own schemes. Xerxes, intrigued by Esther's request, agreed immediately. The king's curiosity was piqued, and so he and Haman attended the banquet prepared by the queen, a banquet that would serve as the setting for the unfolding of Esther's boldest move yet. As they sat at the banquet table, the tension in the air was almost palpable. Esther, poised and calm, watched as the king and Haman indulged in the feast. But her mind was sharp, her thoughts carefully calculating. She knew that this moment was critical, that every word, every gesture would carry weight. Yet she chose to wait a little longer. After the banquet, as the king and Haman were enjoying the festivities, Xerxes once again turned to Esther, his eyes soft with curiosity. "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It will be granted even up to half the kingdom." This was the moment Esther had been waiting for, the moment when she could reveal her true purpose. And yet, in her wisdom, she did not rush. Instead, she chose to invite the king and Haman to another banquet the following day. She had seen the wisdom in delaying her request, in creating a space for the king to ponder the gravity of her words. She knew that one more night would give her the time she needed to prepare, and it would give Haman no opportunity to react too hastily. Esther's approach was not one of rashness or recklessness. It was one of calculated patience, a strategy that would allow her to guide the king to the truth without overwhelming him with too much at once. Her bravery lay not only in her willingness to face death, but in her ability to control the moment, to master the timing of her words. And so the banquet ended, and the king and Haman departed, leaving the room still with the anticipation of what would come next. The scepter had been extended, the first step had been taken, but the true confrontation was still to come. Esther had begun her bold approach, but the real work, the real test, was only just beginning. The air in the palace was thick with anticipation. The king and Haman had just attended a banquet at the queen's invitation, but the true nature of her request had not yet been revealed. Xerxes, eager and curious, had promised Esther that whatever her petition, it would be granted, even up to half of his kingdom. But Esther, calm and poised as ever, had not yet shown her hand. She had asked only for the king and Haman to join her for another banquet on the following day. Why had she not spoken plainly? Why had she not seized the opportunity when she had it? These were questions that swirled through the minds of both the king and his highest advisor. Haman, his ego inflated by the honor of being invited to dine with the queen, could not fathom why Esther had not immediately made her request. He relished in the thought that even in such a delicate setting, he was the one chosen to be there with the queen and the king. It was a rare privilege in the Persian court, and his pride swelled with each passing moment. But for Esther, this was not a time to rush. She had a plan, and her patience was a vital part of it. The banquet had been a success, not because it had achieved her goal, but because it had begun to shift the balance of power in subtle ways. Esther's strategy was as much about timing as it was about words. She had set the stage, and now she would let the situation play out before making her final move. The following day, the king and Haman returned to the queen's chambers, once again seated at her table. The palace had settled into a quiet rhythm, yet the tension in the air remained, hanging like a thick fog. This was the moment when Esther would finally speak, when the curtain would rise and the truth would be laid bare before the king. The fate of the Jews, the people whom Esther held so dear, rested on her ability to navigate this moment with wisdom and courage. As the banquet continued, Xerxes, ever the eager listener, turned to Esther once again. "What is your request, Queen Esther?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "It will be granted even up to half my kingdom." And now Esther took a deep breath. This was her moment. She had steeled herself for this, prepared herself for this confrontation. But as the king's words hung in the air, Esther did something unexpected. She did not immediately respond. Instead, she waited, looking at Xerxes and Haman, her calm gaze never wavering. She knew that her request needed to be delivered at the perfect moment, and that moment had not yet come. With a quiet strength, Esther finally spoke. "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to another banquet I will prepare for them." The room fell silent. The king, surprised by her continued delay, raised an eyebrow. "Why do you ask for yet another banquet, Queen Esther?" he inquired, though his interest was clearly piqued. The intrigue of the situation was growing, and the king was beginning to sense that this was not just another request. It was something much more significant. He could feel the tension rising, and it stirred something within him. Esther's eyes met his. Her voice remained steady, but there was a new edge of determination in her words. "I will tell you then, at the next banquet, what my petition is. But for now, I ask that you and Haman come again to dine with me tomorrow." To Haman, this continued mystery only fueled his sense of superiority. He was the man favored by the king and the queen. His position was unparalleled, and he could not comprehend why Esther was being so cautious. His pride blinded him to the gravity of the situation, and he reveled in the thought that Esther's request would be a matter of mere formality. After all, he had the king's ear, and Esther had no reason to delay her request, unless, of course, she wanted to further elevate his importance. The thought pleased him immensely. But while Haman basked in his pride, Esther was playing the long game. She was not just asking for a second banquet to delay her request. She was forcing the king to wrestle with his curiosity. She was making him wait, making him eager to hear what she had to say. And in this world of royal politics, where every word was a weapon, patience was a powerful tool. As the banquet came to an end, the king and Haman departed, both of them intrigued by the queen's request, both of them unaware of the deadly web that was about to be unveiled. The stage was set, but Esther's work was far from finished. She had planted the seed, but now she would allow it to grow. The queen's strategy was one of subtlety and wisdom. She had chosen to delay her request, to allow the king's curiosity to build, to put Haman in a position where his own ego might cloud his judgment. Each step she took was deliberate, each moment designed to put the right pressure on the right individuals at the right time. It was not only her courage that set Esther apart, but her understanding of when to act, when to wait, and when to strike. As the day drew to a close, Esther knew that the next banquet would be the one that would change everything. It would be the moment when the truth would finally be revealed, when the fate of her people would rest in the hands of the king. For now, though, Esther had played her part. She had used her wisdom, her patience, and her courage to set the stage for what would come next. The first chapter of this crucial story was closed, but the final act was still to come. The time had come. The stage was set, the players in place, and the world of the Persian court had been shifted, ever so subtly, by Esther's actions. The king and Haman, still intrigued by the queen's mysterious requests, arrived once again at her banquet, eager to learn the truth of her petition. The moment of reckoning was upon them. Esther stood in the royal chambers, watching as the king and his chief advisor entered. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air, but she stood tall, a woman transformed by the purpose that had driven her to this point. She had risked everything, her life, her position, her safety, for this one moment. She had played her cards carefully, but now the time for strategy was over. It was time to speak the truth. King Xerxes, his curiosity piqued, took his seat. He looked at Esther, waiting for her to reveal the request that had so captivated his mind. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Haman, seated beside the king, had no idea what was coming. His arrogance had blinded him to the perilous path he had set in motion, and he was still caught in the thrill of his own importance, oblivious to the truth of Esther's intentions. Esther, her gaze unwavering, spoke softly but with a strength that commanded attention. "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition, let my life be spared. This is my request. And let the lives of my people be spared. This is my desire." The words struck like lightning. The king's face, once full of curiosity, turned to one of confusion and concern. "What is this? What are you speaking of, Queen Esther?" he asked, his voice now edged with anxiety. Who is threatening your life and the lives of your people? Speak, and I will give you anything." Esther took a deep breath. She knew this moment would come, but still her heart raced as she continued. "There is a wicked man, an enemy of the Jews. He is the one who has brought about the decree to destroy, kill, and annihilate us. He is the one who seeks to destroy my people. This man is Haman." The room seemed to hold its breath. The weight of Esther's words struck like a thunderclap, shaking the foundation of the palace. Haman, who had once walked proudly through the royal halls, basking in the glow of his power, froze. His face drained of color, his smug expression crumbling into one of disbelief and fear. The king's eyes narrowed as he looked at Haman. For a moment, the tension in the air was thick with the sound of unspoken questions. Xerxes' mind raced, trying to make sense of the turn of events. "What is this?" he repeated, his voice now laced with anger. "Haman, how dare you plot to destroy my queen and her people?" Haman, realizing the gravity of the situation, panicked. He could see the king's wrath building, and in a desperate attempt to save himself, he sprang from his seat and fell at Esther's feet. "Please, Queen Esther, I beg you," he cried, his voice trembling with fear. "I never meant to harm you. I was only seeking the king's favor. Spare me, and I will make it right. I will do anything." But it was too late. The king's fury was already unleashed. His eyes burned with the betrayal that had just been revealed. The man he had trusted, the man he had honored, was now revealed as the architect of a scheme that sought to destroy an entire people, including his beloved queen. Xerxes rose from his throne, his voice loud with anger. "You have plotted to kill my queen, the woman I love, and her people. You have betrayed me, Haman. You will pay for this treachery." Haman's desperation grew. He could see the end coming for him. He had risen to the height of power, only to fall in an instant. But there was no escape now. The king had seen through his lies and manipulation, and his fate was sealed. As Haman was led away to be executed, Esther looked at the king, her heart still heavy with the weight of the truth she had spoken. She had saved her people, but at what cost? The palace, once a place of grandeur and opulence, now felt like a battleground. The tension of the moment had shattered the illusions of power and security that had once defined the Persian court. But there was still more to be done. The decree that had been signed could not be undone. The king's orders had set in motion a chain of events that could not be reversed without action. Xerxes, still enraged, turned to Esther, his face now softer, though the anger had not left his eyes. "What can be done, Esther?" he asked. "How can we stop this from happening?" Esther, who had acted with such boldness and courage, now spoke with a calm that matched the gravity of her situation. "If it pleases the king, let a new decree be issued. Let my people be allowed to defend themselves. Let them have the right to protect themselves from those who would harm them." The king nodded, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. He had been wronged, but now he would correct his mistake. He issued a new decree, one that would allow the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies. The tide had turned, and the fate of the Jewish people had shifted in their favor. Esther's courage had saved her people. Through her strength, her wisdom, and her willingness to risk everything, she had exposed the truth, confronted the enemy, and secured her people's future. The king's wrath against Haman had been swift, but Esther's resolve had been stronger, and now her people could live in peace once again. As the news of the king's decree spread throughout the empire, the Jewish people rejoiced. The nightmare of annihilation had been averted, and the legacy of Esther's courage would live on for generations. The Persian Empire was a land of great splendor, but in the aftermath of Haman's fall, its halls were filled with whispers of victory and relief. The Jewish people, once destined for annihilation, were now granted a second chance, an opportunity to defend themselves and survive. The decree had been issued, the tables had turned, and the darkness that had threatened them was finally pushed back by the light of courage, justice, and divine intervention. Esther, who had risked her life to confront the king, now stood beside him, not just as his queen, but as a woman who had saved her people. Her words had been heard, her pleas had been answered, and her bravery had rewritten the future of an entire nation. But though Haman had been defeated, there was still the matter of the decree. The king's edict, once signed, could not be undone. The orders had been sent out to every corner of the empire, and there was no reversing them. The Jews still faced the prospect of annihilation, and Esther knew that the victory she had achieved would be meaningless if her people were not protected. The king, having seen the true treachery of Haman's plot, turned to Esther with a new resolve. He knew that he could not simply undo what had been done, but he could ensure that the Jews would not be slaughtered. He summoned his scribes and with a swift motion issued a new decree, a decree that would grant the Jewish people the right to defend themselves, to fight back against those who would seek their destruction. In the weeks that followed, the Persian Empire began to change. News of the new decree spread like wildfire. Across the kingdom, Jews and their allies began to prepare, organizing themselves for the day when they would be forced to stand and fight. The fear that had once gripped their hearts began to dissipate, replaced by a new sense of hope. They would not go down without a fight. They would not be slaughtered like sheep. Mordecai, who had stood by Esther's side through every moment of this turbulent journey, was now at the forefront of this great change. His role had shifted from being the quiet protector of his cousin to one of great power and influence. His loyalty to Esther and his courage in uncovering the plot against the king had not gone unnoticed. The king, grateful for Mordecai's actions in saving his life, had decided that Mordecai, too, deserved to be honored. Xerxes, in a gesture of gratitude and recognition, promoted Mordecai to the highest rank in the empire, second only to the king himself. He was given Haman's estate, his wealth, and his position as the king's most trusted advisor. The man who had once sat at the gates, unnoticed and humble, now stood as the most powerful Jew in the empire. His loyalty had been rewarded, and his courage had changed the course of history. But for Mordecai, the promotion was not just a matter of power. It was a testament to the righteousness of his actions. His heart was not filled with pride, but with a deep sense of justice. He had fought not for wealth or position, but for the survival of his people. His new role, though grand, was not about personal glory. It was about fulfilling the promise he had made to Esther, the promise to protect his people and to ensure that the decree of death would not come to pass. As the Jewish people prepared to defend themselves, the empire began to shift. The very people who had once feared for their lives now stood strong, united by a common cause. The royal palace, once a symbol of tyranny and fear, now became a place of justice and mercy. King Xerxes, with the guidance of Esther and Mordecai, had turned his back on the treacherous path that Haman had set him on, and the empire began to reflect the virtues of fairness and righteousness. The day of reckoning came on the 13th day of the 12th month, the day when the original decree had been set into motion. But this time the Jews were not powerless. They were not bound by fate. They were armed with the king's decree, and they fought back with courage and strength. The enemies of the Jews, those who had once believed they could strike down an entire people, found themselves defeated by the very people they had sought to destroy. Esther's bravery had ignited the spark of resistance, and Mordecai's leadership had ensured that the spark became a fire. Together they had saved their people, and together They had restored hope to a nation on the brink of annihilation. When the day had passed and the dust had settled, the Jewish people had triumphed. They had defended themselves, and they had emerged victorious. The threat of annihilation had been vanquished, and the empire had witnessed the strength of a people who refused to bow before fear. In the aftermath of the battle, Mordecai and Esther, alongside the Jewish people, celebrated their victory. The people of Persia, too, recognized the bravery of the Jewish community. And so it was that the Feast of Purim was born, a celebration of deliverance, a reminder of the strength that comes from unity, courage, and faith. Mordecai's promotion, once a symbol of his personal triumph, now stood as a reminder of the strength and resilience of the Jewish people. His leadership, combined with Esther's courage, had saved a nation. Together, they had turned the tides of history and ensured that the Jewish people would endure. And so, the story of Esther and Mordecai became one not just of individual triumphs, but of collective deliverance. The Jewish people were no longer a people without a voice. They were a people who had been heard, and their victory was a testament to the enduring power of faith, courage, and justice. The dust had settled. The battle was over. The Jewish people had been delivered, and the Persian Empire had been forever changed. But in the quiet aftermath of victory, as the kingdom returned to its daily rhythm, one thing remained undeniable: Esther's legacy. She had not been born into greatness. She was not a woman of power or influence, but a young Jewish woman living in the shadows of a vast empire. Yet, when the moment came, when her people faced annihilation and the fate of an entire nation hung in the balance, it was Esther who stepped forward. It was her courage, her wisdom, and her willingness to risk everything that turned the tide. Esther's rise to the throne had been one of beauty and chance, chosen for her grace and poise to be Queen of Persia. But her true strength came not from her outward appearance, but from her inner resolve. When the fate of her people demanded action, she did not shrink back. She did not hide behind the walls of the palace, enjoying the luxury of her position. Instead, she entered the king's presence unbidden, broke the law, and risked her life to speak the truth. Her decision to act, despite the overwhelming fear that gripped her, was the catalyst for an entire people's survival. She was a queen who saw beyond her own safety, a woman whose heart was not swayed by power, but by the urgency of what was right. In doing so, she redefined what it meant to be a leader. She became a symbol of courage, not just for women, but for all who had ever been told that their voices did not matter, that their lives were expendable. The Feast of Purim, which would forever commemorate the deliverance of the Jewish people, was a lasting reminder of her bravery. Every year, the Jewish community would gather in celebration, not only of their physical survival, but of the unwavering faith and courage that Esther had exemplified. Her name would be passed down through generations as a symbol of hope and strength, a beacon for those who faced oppression and hardship. But Esther's legacy went beyond her actions. Her story was a reflection of faith in the face of adversity. She trusted that her purpose was greater than her fear, that the God who had placed her in the palace had a plan for her, and that plan was bigger than herself. Her courage was not born of arrogance or pride, but of a deep, quiet faith that guided her through the most harrowing of times. Her impact reached beyond her own time. The decisions Esther made, her willingness to speak out, to act when others stood silent, to confront the darkness with unwavering resolve, are lessons that resonate even today in a world that still struggles with injustice, inequality, and fear. Esther's story is a reminder that one person standing alone can change the course of history. Mordecai, too, carried a piece of Esther's legacy. As the new leader of the Jewish people, elevated to a position of power second only to the king, he carried forward her vision of justice, faith, and courage. Together, they had rewritten the future of their people. But Mordecai knew that without Esther's actions, none of it would have been possible. It was her courage that had ignited the spark, and it was her leadership that had saved them all. As the years passed and the events of the past faded into history, the story of Esther remained vivid. Her name would echo in the halls of the palace, and her legacy would endure through the ages. Esther's courage was not just a story of a moment in time. It was a story for all time, a story that would be told, retold, and passed down, inspiring generations to come. In the end, Esther's legacy was not only in the lives she saved, but in the way she changed the world around her. She proved that true strength lies in the ability to stand up when it is hardest, to speak the truth when silence is easier, and to act when fear seems insurmountable. Esther's legacy was a legacy of hope, a reminder that in the darkest of times, courage can shine through, and one person's actions can forever alter the course of history.